Welcome to another episode of Shift with Elena. In this conversation, I am joined by Logan Currie and Vrijen Attawar, co-founders of CareerSpan. We talked a bit about their entrepreneurial journey, and which started many, many years ago, and just kind of how did they go from idea to actual execution of this product that they've been working on? How is it going to transform how we approach job search with resumes really being outdated? How do we position ourselves in front of recruiters and employers in a way that makes sense, in a way that is tailored, in a way that works for us as well? What do higher educations have to do with it? What do we as individuals have to do with it? What do companies have to do with it? How can we as a system work better together to help people find, fulfilling careers and be able to stay in those careers, grow in those careers? And if needed to change, how do we actually do it in a way that makes sense, that can be accessible, affordable for all of us? So this is a really interesting conversation. They also talk a little bit about their entrepreneurial journey and kind of just the resilience it takes, the ups and downs, lessons learned, the risk appetite that one might need, and so on. So check it out. It's a great one. And as always, subscribe, share, comment, and let me know what you think. Logan, Vrijen, welcome to the Shift podcast.
Thank you. So very excited to be here.
I'm very excited to talk to you guys. When we first talked, I guess a couple of weeks ago or so, and there was just so much energy because I appreciate talking to people who are creating and building, and that's what the two of you have been doing for majority, I think, of your professional careers, but it's also a very personal journey for you. So I'd love to kick off and just get my audience to get a feel of kind of where you come from. Logan, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Vrijen.
Perfect. Yeah, I always love this. Vrijen and I often take turns telling each other's life story, but I'll kind of do my own today. So I grew up in the States. I went to university in Philadelphia. That felt far because I grew up in North Carolina, and then I ended up moving to Asia right after I graduated. So I was graduated height of 2009, height of the financial crisis, and there weren't too many jobs. So I kind of tried to skirt around that by moving overseas. And it turned into quite an adventure. I was moving originally for 6 months, and then it turned out to be 14 years in Asia overall. So I started out kind of teaching and mentoring younger people and working in a variety of kind of ed tech companies, working in education leadership. And so primarily the first 5 years were in Shanghai in China. And then I moved to Singapore, which is where I met Vrijen. So I was in Singapore for 4 years and then back to Shanghai for 3. So it was a very roundabout, kind of career path, both location wise and in terms of what I was doing. A lot of business development, a lot of admissions consulting. So helping young people ages 15 to 20 think about how to tell their stories in an application setting. Some of this is only obvious in retrospect, which is what happens with so many career kind of twists and turns, and you start seeing through lines when you look at it from a particular lens. So I would probably now call it coaching. At the time, it was, consulting or mentoring. And I think, what ended up happening is that we'd work. So I'll say we, because at this point, Vrijen and I in Singapore were working together, but working with young people around looking ahead, trying to figure out what their strengths were, how to tell their story, often ended up being a longer lasting relationship in the sense that they would get to college, they would come back and say Logan, can you help me look for an internship? Logan, can you help me look for a job? And I started to see how much continued support was both needed and appreciated, if that makes sense. So it's kind of there's all these different inflection points in your career where you're okay, where should I go? You just need a little bit of a touch point. So Vrijen and I, and I'll let Vrijen kind of touch on what we were doing together in Singapore, but in a lot of ways, Vrijen and I were that kind of person for each other. So it was having that, what we now are trying to build in terms of a career companion, but somebody who knows you, who knows your professional experiences, who can kind of be a sounding board and a cheerleader for you at the same time. So I came to Vrijen when I was applying to Harvard. He came to me when he was doing his McKinsey rounds of interviews. It was always the person who's "Oh, you should tell this story." And so that's kind of what we were able to be for hundreds of students from all over the world, and for people in our life that were kind of "Ooh, what should I do?" So we kind of got this default kind of role of helping people reflect on what they're good at. So that's kind of now what I would say is the biggest through line in all of those twists and turns is that's what I was doing for essentially 15 years. And I'm now back in the States and building CareerSpan. So Vrijen, why don't you tell your equally excellent career path?
Yeah, exactly. My side of the coin. I mean, I think in many
Yeah.
ways, Logan's absolutely right. There's been that sort of through line through our careers of, helping other people, but not just helping them, sort of make decisions, but actually helping them figure out how to portray themselves, right? And so, for context, when I graduated university, had a degree in economics, decided to move to Asia and make absolutely no use of it, which again is another career classic. You study something that you think makes sense, and then life happens. And so, as Logan said, we were in Singapore for a while, working on career coaching. Towards the end, both of us really wanted to see if there was a way for coaching to scale, if there was a way for us to have like a one to many sort of impact on the work that people are doing, if there was a way to sort of transmit a lot of these lessons that we'd learned. And we tried briefly. We tried to set up an online course. We tried to figure out ways to make it scalable. But in the end, it really just didn't work because what we realized is you can't just give someone the information, right? If that was the case, then no one would need a career coach because all of the information is out there. And so we tabled that problem for a while. I returned to the US, made my way to business school, graduated with an MBA, worked at McKinsey briefly. And then the literal day that sort of ChatGPT launched was when I sort of had the idea of, okay, is this the technology we were looking for in order to make our kind of long-standing dream happen of making coaching scalable? And so we really drilled down to what are the fundamentals of a great coaching experience. Okay, it involves someone being sat there, as Logan said, listening to you with intent, picking up bits of information about your life, sort of storing that away, and being able to recall that on your behalf and for your benefit at the right time. So about 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago now, 20 days from now, sent Logan a very long message, maybe a couple thousand words, sort of screed, as I like to call it, just sort of explaining what eventually became CareerSpan. And that was sort of the origin of our idea. Decided, pretty much the same day that we wanted to work on this together, and have been moving the company forward since then.
Well, first of all, I feel like I need a Ridgen or Logan. I don't have that in my life. I need a person like that. Like as Logan was speaking, I was like, I don't know. I mean, I guess I have one of my best friends is kind of that, but not exactly like that, you know. So now I need to talk to my friends and be like, we need to talk. We need to get to know each other a little bit more. You need to help me with X, Y, and Z. No, that's
Yeah.
brilliant. I think we all need that, and I think in the world of AI, where we can again take it to the masses, as Ridgen said, like I think that's brilliant. Curious to ask you guys your experience. So as you kind of spent so many years in Asia and now being in the States, and as you're building out this platform, what do you see, if any, other differences between the cultures, like that, like having done this, and in terms of what do people look for in their careers, right? And if you guys can talk a little bit more about like the specific audience you're targeting as well.
Bridgen, you want to take that
Yeah,
or
yeah. I mean,
me to add some on that?
I think culturally they're very different. You can see that sort of manifested in even little things, right? So in Asia, it's pretty regular to have your photo as part of your resume. That's something that we would consider sort of crazy in the US, right? And so there are all these sort of little things that I think reflect the cultural priorities of, where you are. I think the kind of consistent challenge throughout is how do I portray myself in a way that this audience is looking for? And so maybe
Yeah.
what they're looking for may vary a little bit. I think out east, I think the thinking is still, very hard skills focused. In many ways, that's true in the US as well. It's very focused on, do you have the raw competence to do the specific tasks of your job? I think that's changing a little bit more in the US, but I think unfortunately, the forms that we use to put ourselves forward are still really archaic. So what I mean by that is, resumes are still very, simplistic documents that really only skim the surface of who you are, right? That's become sort of a universal standard. It may be interpreted in slightly different ways across cultures, but it is still, there that we see one of the biggest limitations around how I can put myself forward, especially if you're someone who first leads with soft skills rather than leads with hard skills. So I think there's just that sort of inherent problem in the system.
Mm. Logan,
And I
anything you want
think
to add?
really quick, yeah, to add to that, like I always like It was almost foreign to me when I first moved to Asia because I took like a teaching English as a foreign language course of how to teach English. And it feels kind of like, oh, I speak it. I should be able to just be able to teach it, right? And it was in that course where it was breaking down the mechanics of your own language that you're like, oh, I see how this is really difficult to understand. Does that make sense? So you're like, oh, I didn't even think about these gerunds and like past simple and past perfect. You know it from a young age, and you're kind of brought up in it in a way that, unless you look at it from an outsider's perspective and then try to translate that to other people of these are the ways in which you can do this, it feels easy. And I think that a lot of that has helped us, especially when it comes to careers and the application processes, because we have explained it and worked with people from outside the US system. A lot of times you're like, okay, these are the norms. And so much of that, and I think that it's not unique to, people outside the US versus inside the US, because we talk to job seekers all day long, and there is so much that is not taught and not known across different social strata within the US. So it's even more frustrating, I think, for a lot of people here where they're like, nobody told me this. And it's all of this hidden curriculum around, oh, well, you shouldn't really put, definitely put your skills at the top of your resume. And you should probably never repeat too much information from your resume into your cover letter. And people are like, I didn't know that. I've been applying to jobs for 3 months and nobody told me this, because there's so much information out there, but none of it is not all of it feels accessible to who you are and where you are, right? So I think that has actually helped us in a lot of ways, because we've seen it from both sides of the equation, and we know essentially how to break it down for all different types of audiences, because we've seen it as an outsider and as an insider. And I think that's actually helped us a lot in terms of how can we make this accessible to people and helpful and actionable. You shouldn't be optimizing your skill set to be really good at resume writing. Like, that's such a waste of time. Like, why get better at applying to jobs instead of getting better at the job that you're trying to do? So that's kind of the streamlining that we are really passionate about helping people get to.
Yeah, I think this individualized approach to just careers in general is so needed. And I'm always mind blown, because it's like you guys said, there's so much information out there, but yet it is still such a needed support for but not everybody can afford it. Not everybody can afford a one-on-one coaching. So having, being able to make it accessible and affordable, I think, which is what you guys are trying to do with your platform, I think that's kind of where it's at. But let me take you guys back a little bit. So everybody has ideas, right? So there are a lot of ideas out there. And I think this world of entrepreneurship is very romanticized. It's very, it's a hot and trendy thing. But walk me through the journey, whatever you're willing to share, of course, in terms of you got this idea, and then how do you develop the product? How did you test it out? Like, did you do it internally? Did you outsource the development of it? I'm just curious.
Oh man. So, I mean, I think one important piece of context to know is that Logan and I are both non-technical founders, right? And so for us, it was, I would say, a little additionally difficult because we didn't possess, not only didn't have a deep bench of sort of tech friends or tech talent or sort of, just tech experience even to build a product out. But I would say secondarily, when you're non-technical, you don't have the ability to just create, right? You can't just jump in and sort of make a prototype and get it tested out. And so I would say, maybe the first 6 to 8 months of our existence were marked by a lot of challenges that included the challenge of finding the right sort of technical collaborator. We had two false dawns with two co-founders that, didn't really work out for a variety of reasons. And so it actually took finding our current chief product officer, Ilsa, for us to have a reliable sort of technical collaborator, someone that can actually build enough out that we can go out and test it. I think the other thing she brought was a lot of sort of tech expertise around how to, sort of simplify the problem, how to focus on specific components of the problem. And so that was sort of the missing piece. But I would say once we found that missing piece, things have accelerated very quickly. So we hired Ilsa, just over a year ago. Have made major strides since then, actually managed to release about 3 different versions of the product, each sort of building on the lessons and what we learned, from the previous version. And it's just, frankly, a lot of trial and error. I mean, there's this, saying that you often say that I hear, kind of the Pareto principle, that 80% of your outcomes come from 20% of what you did. Some days it feels like even less. than 20%. But I think that's really what you sort of need to do in those early days, is stick to a pattern of, trying something out, getting in front of users, seeing how they respond to it, realizing that they're responding poorly, but most importantly, realizing why, the response isn't what you want it to be, and sort of really thinking very deeply on ways in which you can make your product more sort of accessible and easier to adopt. So I think after that initial stage of sort of, maybe small scale experiments, but really meaningful in terms of deciding the final direction, you switch to sort of like experiments that are still small in terms of the adjustments you make, but are more about iteratively refining what you have rather than making sort of big directional changes.
And I think maybe this is like, hokey, but I think so much I think there's another stat that it's like 50% of startups fail because of founder issues. And like, I think the fact that Bridget and I, it wasn't a tech company that we started, but we are second time co-founders in the sense that we did start a company together in Singapore. We, went through all of the growing pains and the logistics and like, okay, we're our own bosses. How should we be responsible to each other? All this kind of stuff. So I think the fact that the disadvantages, I think that are inherent in not being technical are also kind of balanced by the fact that we have a very strong working relationship and knowledge of each other that's been built over 9 years. So it's like, I think that has also allowed us to kind of take some hits, go back, like not kind of lose too much steam. And also there's a little bit of something in terms of entrepreneurship when it comes to risk and learning. And I think that the fact that we met not in our own country, in a third country, and we had already taken that leap individually to kind of have a little bit more of a risk-taking mindset and being outside of our comfort zone. I think that the learning curve is faster because of that, or thanks to that. So I think that, okay, there's no ego in anything that we're doing. We've all been, we took a trip to like Cambodia in 2017 or whatever. It's like you're just like wandering around and you're like, I don't know how to communicate here. But it's like you kind of fall on your face enough when you're traveling a lot or when you're in new places that you're kind of like, I have complete humility at all points in time. And I think that's where, if you have to do like charades in a field to like understand what you're going through, like, and you're like, I don't know how we're going to get this across. I think that there's an inherent kind of like, listen, we're working really hard. We're super passionate about this. And you still have to like laugh at yourself, have fun, be like, well, that didn't work, pick ourselves back up and go do it again. So I think there is that kind of, let's do this with a good sense of optimism or kind of humor in it as well.
Mm. It's interesting. You mentioned the appetite for risk. So when I got into entrepreneurship in 2019, my appetite for risk was very high. And now I don't know about you guys, but I see myself like, I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's because I'm just getting older. I don't know if I understand the roller coaster of starting something. So like now I mentioned to you guys when we chatted offline before, is like I'm working on a product and I am looking at like all the possible risks because my risk appetite is not. So I'm curious, like from your perspective, from lessons you took from the first time, what are you taking now? Like, are you able to manage risk better now based on your first experience, or like is it you're like, nope, it's just all risky? Like, what were some lessons you took from the first time? Because it is risky, but what was the lessons you took from the first time that you're now bringing into this experience?
Go ahead,
There's
Lux.
always no, I mean, I wouldn't say that our risk appetite has necessarily changed. Like we kept joking to each other at some point in the first year that it was like, well, we've gone this far, like the only way out is through. And so like that was a refrain. It's like, okay, like let's see where this goes. I think as far as lessons from the first time, like there's risk, but there's also so much support and it's such a fantastic community, I think, in a lot of ways. And I think for me, at least, the lessons from the first time is that like the people that you're learning from and the people that are supporting you around, like that, those relationships are so important that like, and I think people appreciate, I think, like the idea that you're taking a risk. And I think that's even our meeting. It's like people want to connect you with people that could be helpful, that could be, even just a good conversation. And I think that's been incredible as a counterbalance or as kind of like a bonus where you're like, we are taking a big risk, but we're also being able to learn from and get plugged into really fascinating and important networks that we wouldn't have been able to access otherwise. So for me, at least, maybe that's just for me, I'd be curious to hear your point, but V, but like that's been a real bonus this time around. That it's like people want to see you succeed for the most part, and so it's like, oh, it
Hmm.
feels like we have kind of like different communities of cheerleaders that are kind of like, this is worth it. So yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think the baseline appetite for risk exists, but I think as you do this more, as I'm sure you've learned as well, Elena, that as you do it more, your understanding of what is a risk improves, right? Your sort of resolution on the risk taking gets much higher. For instance, I would say there was a lot of like just plain naivete associated with starting a company. I think that's true for like anyone, right? You have to be sort of overly optimistic and sort of say, hey, this is going to work out. And I think that is, in a sense, taking a massive risk. But I think as you proceed to the individual decisions you make along that path, some are more or less risky, and you sort of learn how to risk mitigate. You learn, when something may feel really risky and actually isn't, right? So obviously, it would be nice to have had this conversation a year from now where we could really say yes. The concept of a career coach has really taken off, and we really made that happen. But I would say even now, when we started, it was a massive risk. You could see it out in the space that no one's really approaching the problem the way that we are. No one's really working on the solution the way that we are. That was very true about 2 years ago, and so you could argue, on the basis of just looking at what's out there, hey, this is a highly risky thing to do, right? The market is sort of indicating that there isn't this need for the service, to the extent that you would sort of claim. But then, there's always the part of us that sort of, it just clicks. It makes sense. It always made sense that, folks would need, as we've established on this call, that sort of trusted resource, somewhere they can go to, somewhere they can share their achievements, somewhere they can get, sort of really personalized advice that would only really come out for them and no one else. That need is sort of persistent. And so I think it's just, to an extent as well, the frame of reference you have for that risk, right? Because and I think that's the cool thing about being an entrepreneur, especially when you're successful, is you've taken an idea from the stage where it's all risk, right? There's literally nothing besides like the risks associated with all the ways that this idea that you have can go wrong. And I guess, almost the last 2 years have been a process of sort of de-risking that core concept, right? To the point where now, we see people use it organically. We see people sort of benefit from it. We have power users, which is such a cool thing to sort of see. And so you can see how that, you compare that to the first version of the product where, basically no one took to it. You can sort of see how that process of de-risking has led itself to a better product in the present day.
Mm. What's funny when you mentioned about kind of this overly optimistic thinking. I was laughing with a good friend of mine because I realized that, at least in my experience, I've overcomplicated things from my first couple of businesses, and my partner started a business, his first business, about 6 months ago. And granted, it's a little bit different audience. So he services a lot of like small mom and pop shops, and like that's his customers, and like restaurants and salons and stuff like that. And then I was like, oh, like, how's it going? Like, what's your strategy? Like, what? And he was like, oh, I just went up there and I just talked to them, and then my head, like, it was just so simple for him. And then I called my friend who also like was like in a startup, like tech startup world. And I was like, he just kind of called them and went up there, and like, I was like, I would never do that. I would need to have like a strategy. And he just literally just called up and he's like, hey, I'm so and so, like, can I come talk to you? Like, and granted, it's a little bit different audience, but that naive piece, that overly optimistic, that like you're like, oh, I'm just gonna go and ask. I feel
Yeah.
I've lost that, and I'm learning from him because I've lost that. I'm like, I'm overcomplicated now. I'm like, I need to have data, I need to have this, I need to have a sexy presentation, I need, you know what I mean? Like, I've overcomplicated it. And so to your point, and I mean, it's good that you guys are still in that. I've lost it somewhere along the way. I'm really nervous about myself at this point.
I think you make a really good point, right? We often sort of view learnings as purely positive and sort of kind of purely sort of linearly increasing, right? So it's like, as I gain more experience, I become smarter, I become more capable. I think on the aggregate that's true, but I think you give a really good example of like, like founder scar tissue. Like there is this sort of stuff that builds up that, or it's like you got injured, you broke your foot and you didn't have it set correctly, which may, in the analogy, refer to sort of re-examining the thing that sort of caused that damage and really making sure you got the right lessons out of it. I think we all have that, right? I certainly
Mm.
have things where I am overcorrecting as a result of mistakes made in the past, or I'm misapplying, sort of the principle that I took away from a mistake in this new context. And I think that A will always happen. I think we, sort of when we exist in a vacuum and it's sort of only in our own heads, we sort of lose that ability. But I think that's where there's a real advantage in having a multi-person sort of founder team. I think there's also there that advantage in, like, working with folks that know that they can always speak truthfully to you, because the only way to sort of overcome that is to have other people in your life that can speak to you honestly, that can tell you, hey, you're overcomplicating things. Or sometimes even, like your partner did, Logan does for me all the time. She's just like, well, let me just show you, right? Let me just like show you that this can work. There are a number of times where she's like point out, we're going back and forth, and she's like, all right, let me just do this, and then we'll see if it works. And on some level, that's honestly relieving a lot of the times, because it's like, all right, someone's taking like moral responsibility for making this decision that I'm clearly too like
Moral,
fritzed out to
yeah.
make. Moral, ethical, personal, but oftentimes it works, right? Like that's, I think, and the times that it doesn't, we both learn something new, right? So I think that's also where the importance of having a really good partner that brings something different from you, I think really makes a huge difference and can sort of help overcome some of that founder scar tissue.
Yeah, I like that, the founder scar tissue. I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good, because I'd also be curious, Elena, like when it comes to, there are parallels. We've talked a lot about how there are so many parallels with like the, the individual journey that you have in your career and what stories you tell yourself and how you're presenting yourself like to the market. And founders in entrepreneurs, you're telling a company story to a market that's maybe more specific, but it's very similar in a lot of ways. The idea of like, okay, what's my pitch? How am I gonna like come across in these ways? So there's these kind of like parallel journeys. And like when it comes to both individuals and also founders, I would say is that it's all about like the stories that you're telling yourself. So it's like if you look back and you're like, okay, what was it that was like a turning point for me? And then can I reinvestigate this or tell myself a different story? And I'm just going straight into coaching mode. I apologize. But it's like,
I love it.
how can you look at something, some series of events that happened and try to apply a different lens in it? You know what I mean? And then say like, okay, because it's the world's worst experiment, right? You're like, which variable was it? And you're like, there's no way to like pinpoint it, right? So it could have been the timing, it could have been the market or whatever. And then I think that it's all about that, like, that idea of narrative, I think is actually really powerful when it comes to reinvestigating and kind of like that self-reflection. We always joke that it's like the least sexy thing to start a company around is self-reflection, but like it's also the thing that we don't make time for and the thing that is very powerful because it comes down to confidence and what I think I'm capable of, right? And that determines so much of how we comport ourselves when we meet new people, how we approach challenging situations. It comes down to self-efficacy, right? In terms like, do I think that I can do this? And I think that that's where that can shift over time. And it's not that you always need to be like maximally confident or whatever, but like I think that it comes down to that core of how can we help people empower themselves to take charge in different ways. And it's not just, oh, can I be the most ambitious version of myself? That's not what it's about, but it's like that I can reach a decision point and know that I have a few options to be a little bit more proactive instead of reactive. Because what ends up happening when you don't do some of the self-reflection, you don't have that foundation of self-understanding and guidance and kind of that nice, really like mirror of like, oh, this is cool. This is interesting what I did. Then you essentially are limiting the options when it comes down to it. And it's sometimes at a very, very stressful time period where you don't have laid off or a company fails or something goes wrong that you're like, okay, what do I have to fall back on? And that's really like a big, very human question when it comes down to it. It's like, okay, I have my skills, I have my stories. These are what we often call like your career IP, is something like where, how can I marry the skills that I've gained, that I've worked hard on, and I have experience with the stories that kind of prove to a particular audience that I can do the things that I am capable of doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, how are we safeguarding those is a bigger question that we're very interested in exploring, because right now it's kind of in between like a LinkedIn and an old Word document, and that's kind of where we want to be able to build CareerSpan as a repository for those skills and for those stories that help you, not just when you're applying to a job, but when you're in a promotion cycle, when it's time to do your self-evaluation, when you're like, ooh, I think I might want to switch careers. That is a really powerful corpus of information and kind of knowledge about yourself that can be leveraged in a lot of different ways on your behalf, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I felt like I got a
Yeah.
full coaching session from Logan. No, I think it's really spot on. And as you're speaking, I'm just like reflecting. And it's one of those things where I think entrepreneurship, there's a level of resilience that you need to have to be an entrepreneur. And if anything, when you walk away from the experience, it's heart-wrenching, like if it doesn't work out, but at the same time, it gives you a strange kind of confidence, because you're like, wait a minute, I did it. I made money. I survived. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
I have my
Yep.
skills. I have my, and it's like, it actually gives you that confidence that even taking the step itself, like having the courage to actually take the step, I think gives so much, like at least have given, I'm sure you guys feel the same way. It gives you so much as an individual to actually try and actually do that thing, because so
Yeah.
many people
Yeah.
talk about taking that step, but then it's they don't, it's the fear that stops you. So I think that just being able
Yeah.
to like
Yeah.
take that step, and then that's essentially how you build resilience, is doing something even though you're afraid, right?
Totally. Totally.
Absolutely.
I'm curious.
It's something I tell. Oh no, just a little refrain I try to tell my
Yeah.
kids is like, you can only be brave when you're afraid. And that is like that's very simplistic. They're 3 and 5, but it's like, it's like, how can I do something even when I'm feeling this way? And I think that that's like a big part of risk taking and putting yourself out there is kind of like doing it in spite of feeling scary. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted your question.
It's okay, totally okay. I'm curious with, in the world of just tech and education and AI and all the things that are happening, what are some hot trends that you guys are seeing? Any game changers that you see in the market? What are you keeping an eye out on? Because I feel like it's changing all the time. It's like every week, every month, something new is coming out. Somebody's doing it faster and better. Sometimes speed is like is a whole thing on its own, right? Like just being able to do things faster than the next guy. So what are you guys seeing in the market?
Yeah, I mean, so much. It often feels like, I think the refrain that we have is often like, it's like drinking from a fire hose, because you're just like, this new thing is coming out and this new thing is coming out. And there is so much movement. I think that, I was just at a kind of tech conference last week, and they were like, okay, and it was an investor panel, and they said one of the key questions that we ask all startups is, like, will the next release of ChatGPT, like, will it help you, or will it potentially like take your, take
Yeah.
part of your business away? And I think that's an interesting question, because it's like, are you building for the future is now increasingly quite uncertain, right? Because you're like, what future and how far are things going to develop? And, I think that when it comes to like the kind of career tech, work tech, ed tech space, it's a fascinating area of development. I think there's a lot of interesting companies trying to solve big problems. Personally, I'm curious about, the endless question of engagement, in terms of how people are, using something. I think there's some slightly not easier, but like there's different problem sets with K through 12, with higher ed, and then, within the workspace. I think that one trend that we see a lot, and maybe V, you can talk about this a little bit more, is, within AI and hiring and the recruiting cycles, there's a lot of companies that have started doing auto apply, like on behalf of candidates. And that is a bit of a worrying trend, just because there's now so much noise in the job market. Like, we also talk to a lot of recruiters and hiring managers, every week essentially. And they're like, it's increasingly impossible to get the cut through to understand what a candidate is really, capable of if all the resumes have been written by ChatGPT, right? So I think that there's the same advantages. It's not necessarily the point that like a rising tide lifts all ships in this scenario, because it is hard to stand out. And if a recruiter opens a position and they get 500 applications within the first hour, which is there's been some cases of, then how it becomes more about a lot more reliant on warm introductions, on referrals, and that is very much dependent on your own social capital. And that's not a equitable situation to be in, right? So it's who who can get you in front of a hiring manager in a good conversation. So I think that is one trend within kind of AI and the workforce that is a little bit worrying. I don't know if you want to kind of follow up on that, but overall, I think it's exciting. I think there's also just the idea of responsible use of AI. What are people accepting money for, right? And I think that's that's a bit an open question that I think we'll continue to investigate.
Yeah, I mean, I would go even further. I think I think in many ways, we're in the process of it getting worse before it gets better. I think is the way that I would sort of describe it. So for me, auto apply is pretty much the bane of every recruiter's existence. If you actually look into the specifics of how a lot of these auto apply jobs work, or kind of tools work, they're just as liable to have you apply for, you know, plumber in Flint, Michigan, as they are have you apply for project manager in New York City, right? There's like literally no discriminating between jobs. Presumably some have gotten a little bit better at this point. But what sort of folks fail to sort of realize is that, number one, as the flood of resumes increases, the need for your stuff to be tailored or customizes also increases, right? Over half of recruiters say that the best thing that you can do to improve your chances for applying to a job or the job that they're managing is to tailor your resume. Right. Now that's crazy. Everyone knows to work on your resume. So how is that advice? Well, the important part is the word tailor, right? They really want to see that the resume aligns with the job that you're looking for. So in addition to what Logan was saying around the importance of networking, around the importance of, warm and cold introductions, which, hey, guess what, involves you being a better representative of your professional brand. You are also required nowadays to, sort of tailor your resume to the extent that your professional brand is always perfectly oriented, in a way that sort of aligns with the job description. And in many ways, it's what I call an informational problem, right? A resume only contains so much just units of information about you, and oftentimes or always the AI doesn't know what it doesn't know. And so just dropping your resume into ChatGPT and saying, hey, tailor it for this job description. I mean, we've run tests on that exact function, right? We're building out a lot of that technology in our product. Why is it that we haven't done it the exact way? Well, it's because the resume doesn't informationally contain enough about you to give you that right and proper tailoring experience, right? What you need, in other words, is this sort of central, disambiguated repository of everything about Elena. And you need that to sort of exist in the ether, and then you need an AI that's intelligent enough to pick out the most relevant bits and do that sort of matching and alignment process. And so that's really, to sort of build on that question of trends. I think in addition to the trend that we're seeing of sort of folks, using and maybe misusing AI, although not intentionally, I don't want to place any blame on the candidates because obviously they're in a very tough situation, right? And it's problematic because they don't know enough about careers, and oftentimes they don't know enough about recruiting to know that they're shooting themselves in the foot. But for the folks that are in the know, like us, that's why we want to build a product that sort of reflects the actual problems that exist within the system, and not just sort of a band-aid tool or the quintessential GPT wrapper that just runs a couple of instructions, gives you an output, and makes you feel like you're making progress. but you're actually not.
Have you guys seen any uptick in like video resumes? That was like a hot thing for a minute. Like everybody was like doing the videos. I don't know, it was like all over like, oh, the video resume is the new thing and so on. Or like these slides, like the slides, the PowerPoint slides. I see them from time to time on LinkedIn and I think it's kind of creative, but I'm curious how do companies react to it?
I think it varies. I think your mileage really varies based on a couple of factors. So one, it varies based on the specific role that you have, right? So if you're in a more creative role, if you're in a role that requires a little bit more, sort of pizzazz in the materials that you submit, or a little bit more creativity in the form and the function of what you submit, then totally acceptable, right? And I think that's to an extent what folks are looking for. I think adjacent to that are folks that, the role they're applying for doesn't require a lot of creativity, but they apply the right type of creativity for that particular context. So the example I love giving is there was this person who submitted a resume to Spotify, but they formatted the actual resume to look like Spotify's interface, right? That's really cool.
That's
That helps
cool.
you stand out. It's a little bit of a one trick thing that would only work in certain specific circumstances, i.e., a company with a brand and an aesthetic and a UX, UI as sort of iconic as Spotify. But that does work, right? So I think there
Mhm.
are ways to sort of apply that creativity. I think for most candidates, the creativity you want to be applying relates to the creativity that you show in the networking process and in the way in which you make inroads into a company. I would say that most likely matters more than your materials, because the disadvantage of being hyper creative when it comes to your materials is that, maybe the ATS system doesn't read it correctly, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden you're out of luck because, well, guess what, it didn't read it correctly, so it didn't scan it correctly, and so it didn't give you the score that you needed, and so despite all the effort you put in, it sort of counts for nothing, right?
Mhm.
Or with video interviews, which you asked for specifically, I think what we're more so seeing is companies asking for video answers to be recorded as part of what they submit. And I have my own issues with that, frankly. I don't think it really gives folks the best opportunity to put themselves forward. Like, I think it's very biased in favor of sort of folks that can present well in a recorded setting, which I only say not to like overuse the word bias, but also because there's folks like me that present perfectly fine in an interview setting, but don't really love being recorded, right? And so it just isn't fit for purpose. You're not actually giving those folks a ton of design, or a ton of practice. If it was industry wide and you had to do it for every
Yeah.
interview, okay, that's one thing, right? But oftentimes these sort of one off ways of evaluating candidates don't actually turn out to necessarily give you the best candidate. They just end up like advantaging some people and disadvantaging others. Just like the resume, all of the protocols needed to make modern resume, either you know it, in which case you're advantaged, or you don't know it, in which case you're disadvantaged, right? So it's unfortunately a lot of these sort of no-win situations emerge for candidates regularly.
And I think it just frankly like puts a lot more burden on an individual who's already either stressed economically or trying to just get their foot in the door, and they're like, "Oh, well, should I be spending more time on a creative Canva resume or putting together a video portfolio of myself?" Like, it's more burden on the candidate with no clear path to or answers in terms of, is this actually going to get me ahead? And so it feels like it's changing the goalposts constantly.
Hmm.
Video interview. Okay, should I optimize for that? Should I be practicing every day in front of, a Zoom screen? Should I be working on my design skills? Like, there are more tools out there to help support people, but I worry that it's already a really time consuming process to apply for jobs. And you're like, okay, and there's no data, right? There's none of this feedback loop. You never hear back from most recruiters when you don't get an offer for a screening call. So it's like, the only thing you can do is work on your material. So it's like, okay, if I've sent out 50 applications and I got 10 screening calls, that means that I'm like, probably have the good combination of targeting the right type of role for me and like my
Hmm.
materials, right? But it's like those data points like are kind of hard to come by because it's such a volatile market right now. So I think anyway, I'm curious to see where it goes, because I think a lot of companies are trying to find different ways of evaluating candidates. Like there's some that are really like skills-based hiring forward, which I think is a very good movement. However, I just worry that they're optimizing for time saved on the company's behalf and not time saved on the candidate's behalf. And so then it becomes, even more unlikely for people to be able to spend, like, essentially have a full-time job looking for a
Hmm.
job. Like that
Mm,
is very,
Yeah.
very challenging for a lot of people.
mm,
Yeah. And the last thing I would say is I think to employers, what I would say is if you're going to add another component to your interview process, like, on the surface of it, recorded video answer sounds great, right? And it's very easy for an employer to make that decision. They're like, well, I get more information, not less. I get to hear them talk. I get to see their face. This sounds like a win for me. But, I think if you really examine the issue itself, you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, I'm signing myself up for all of this additional data from user or from
Mm.
candidates. It's kind of unethical to ask someone for it and not review it, so I'm obliged to review it. It's kind of still mixed whether one should rely entirely on AI to sort of scan those answers. So that's another sort of ethical quandary. And at the end of the day, as I mentioned earlier, you're putting folks in this sort of artificial environment that doesn't necessarily reflect anything really to do with their day-to-day responsibilities, or
Mhm.
doesn't even actually really reflect their ability to excel in the interview process. So like, what have you gained really, and so I would really encourage employers to take a good hard look, and I get why they're doing it. I think fundamentally the pipeline that we have built, or that we have come about in society, this sort of resume industrial complex, as I like to call it, it is just not very good. And so that's something that, maybe farther down, we have some plans for sort of like tackling. But I think that is really, it's the system itself that we've set up that is not so great for employers, not so great for candidates. Really, the only people that win are the ATS providers, right? Everyone else is sort of out of luck, or maybe the job boards that posted. Everyone else is sort of, not really getting what they want out of it.
yeah, and it's I like to be optimistic about these things, but I just see it's gonna continue to expand that gap, Logan, as you mentioned, that it's because even now, there's so much, it seems like it should be common sense, but it's not common sense in terms of the application
Mm.
process, how to apply like, so we don't know what we don't know, and there are a lot of people just don't know how to effectively apply for a
Yeah.
job.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And then the other part of it also is, I always look at it like three responsible parties. One, in my head, it's the higher education institutions or the education
Mhm.
institutions, because there's a big lack of teaching kids soft skills that are
Yeah.
needed to be successful, right? Like that's the business I'm in, is I'm trying to close that gap between like,
Hmm.
the lack of just presentation skills and so on.
Yeah.
And then of course there's the individual. I think a lot of young people today expect to have a job, and because they've graduated, and there's this
Mm.
expectation and privilege of like, this privileged mindset where, well, I've got a degree, I should get a job, but they don't know how to play the game, and it's kind of
Yeah.
counterproductive as well, because like, well, if so many people don't know how to play the game, and it is a game in a way, like you have to know the rules basically in order to win the
Yeah.
game, and it's kind of sad in a way that only people that know how to play the game win, and they're not always the best qualified candidates, because, do you know what I'm saying? So it's like there's a lot of
Hmm.
different things, and then the third party, of course, is the companies, as you guys are saying, right? Like, what are some better ways? And 30% of what we do is recruitment. And I was literally
Mm.
talking to one of my team members last week, and he said, we had like, over 200 people apply for a particular role. And even when we do the knockout questions, when you apply and it's like a yes or no, if you answer no, it's like it knocks you out.
Yeah.
Even that, people will still say like yes, and we'll call them to like screen, and they'll be like, oh well, actually, let's say, do you have a clearance? Oh well, yeah, but I'm not sure if it expired or not. Like, you just wasted everybody's time. You're hurting your fellow applicants. Do you know what I'm saying? So
Mm.
that's another thing, because people also apply to jobs they don't qualify for, and that's why
Yeah.
you
Hmm.
end up with hundreds, or they're using ChatGPT, Logan, you were saying, and like, and
Yeah.
or recruitment agencies applying for them. So I think there's a lot
Yeah.
of it's like a system problem. But
Totally.
that's why CareerSpan is there, hopefully to solve at least some of that. So if you had a magic wand, CareerSpan
Mm.
has made it. What does that look like?
I think Well, I'll let V does a great job of kind of painting the ultimate picture. I think I want to like maybe show a part of the stepping stone to like what the ultimate vision is in terms of, I'm glad you brought up higher education, because I think that that is a key. This is a three-legged stool, right? And I think that that's a key piece of this in terms of the greater need for upskilling and credentialing, and how do I move up any sort of, a ladder or whatever you want to call it in terms of that career mobility. It comes with adding additional skills, whether that's new with a new micro credential, whether a graduate degree, whether, a boot camp or whatever it is. And I
Hmm.
think that, where we've started essentially, and V can go to the big picture, but the reason we've started where we are in partnering with graduate degree providers, with boot camp providers, and with mentoring and kind of nonprofit organizations, is that there's still a really important piece for human coaches to play here, right? There's not, AI is not going to replace the empathy, the emotional intelligence, the strategy, the
Hmm.
like practice that a human coach can bring. What we have seen already is that our AI can help candidates, like essentially, or students, whatever they are, they can get more ready, they can up their readiness factor so that a human coach can be that much more effective and optimize like where the human comes into the process. So there's always the human in the loop, but it's essentially like, how can we supplement with AI these workflows that already exist? And so it's like, whatever your puzzle looks like in an institution, we essentially can slot in at the beginning, in the middle, towards the end of the process. And that's where I think it's really exciting to see that, listen, we can scale this like just in time coaching that
Hmm.
institutions and organizations are already doing by helping the existing coaching staff be that much more effective with the help that they're offering. But that's
Hmm.
kind of, the medium term or the kind of short term, what we're working on over the next few months. And we're starting some really exciting pilot programs. Anybody listening who is interested in this, seeing how this product could work for your institutions, for your cohorts, like, suggest that you reach out. We're kind of scheduling pilot onboarding into January, February at this point, but we can
Hmm.
kind of talk to a variety of cohort sizes at the moment. But and then V, I think I'd love to hear your kind of your ultimate vision of the career companion, which is why we're calling ourselves the career companion, and what CareerSpan as a name really kind of
Hmm.
what reveals about our purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, thank you for that setup, Logs. I think you're absolutely right. In the immediate term, sort of our goal is to provide that just-in-time coaching and to give, build a kind of product that lends itself to both supporting an individual developing their sort of professional brand and developing that skill, that meta skill rather, of self-advocacy. I think
Hmm.
that's sort of the medium term, as Logan said. I think our end goal is to be a first of its type product, right? A career companion, the kind of tool that is with you throughout the entirety of your career, that has this sort of repository of your experiences, that acts as sort of the place that you turn to when you need hyper personalized advice, that acts as, eventually can even just connect directly to an ATS system and replace the need of a resume altogether. Because, if you've been using CareerSpan effectively, you've given us an order of magnitude 10 times the information that you have about yourself in a resume. And so it makes just natural sense for us to connect that data pipeline to an Indeed, to a Greenhouse.io, whatever it may be, and sort of pump through not just all of the bits of data that you would see on the resume, but a ton of stuff that you wouldn't, right? One of the cool things about engaging in a conversation with our AI career coach is it doesn't just pick out hard skills that you've exhibited, it picks up soft skills. It's able to identify sort of the underlying values associated with how you do things. It's able to make commentary on sort of the mindset that you showed when you talked about a particular experience. These are valuable data points for employers, because the reality is the vast majority of hires fail because of a soft skill mismatch or an attitude mismatch, or sort of a values mismatch, right?
Mhm.
And so those are the kind of pieces of information, the data that is ultimately going to drive better hiring decisions, and is also, I would say, going to uncover all of these fantastically talented candidates that can do a job for you, that can probably do that job for you as an employer at a much lower rate than just the folks that you're hiring that have the really obvious experience. And so that's another effect that we hope to have, is to help these sort of unappreciated gems come to the fore, and actually kickstart their career. But ultimately that's what we want from the career companion. Is it's not just accompanying you for the entirety of your career span, but is also an asset for you and allows you to really build the career of your dreams, not just in terms of earnings, but also in terms of satisfaction with what you do, and in terms of the impact that you have on the world around you. So that's sort of the grand vision, and we'll see how far we get.
I see it. I feel it. I'm excited for it. I think it's going to be awesome. I'm rooting for you guys, and really, I look forward to, maybe we can do this again in like a year or two, see where you guys are more. It's always interesting to see.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's gonna reach the stars. So really good luck to you guys. Thank you for this. Where can people find you? Where do you hang out at?
MyCareerSpan.com is our website. We've got lots of different ways to contact us there. Vrijen Attawar is my co-founder, a leader extraordinaire over here. He's on LinkedIn, and my name is Logan Currie, also on LinkedIn.
Yeah, add us.
I'll make sure to add all that in the show notes for people who are listening. Guys, thank you so much. Best of luck, and we'll chat again soon.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for this chance.